Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to Nodes and welcome to our next video on our JavaScript stories. And today we will be discussing about the new topics which is known as scope and scope chaining. And with that said, let's get started. So let's move on to our next slide, and here you can see that we are having our roadmap and we have covered a lot in our JavaScript stories. So today our topic is our scope and scope chain, and we are in our next station in our roadmap. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide and let's discuss that what scope is and what scope chain is. Okay, so these two are very different topics, right? Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, and here you can see that I'm having a definition of a scope. Now whenever you think of scope, just imagine that it's a boundary in which it is allowed to access that specific variable, right? So let's say if there is a person who is living in my neighborhood who is having a name of John, so yeah, that person is inside my scope because that lives inside my neighborhood, right? So I can access that person, right? But let's say if there is someone living let's say abroad or any other country, and his name is also John, but that person is obviously not accessible because it's out of my scope, right? It's not inside my boundary or inside my country, right? So just assume the concept of scope is same like that, right? So let's say here you can see that I've written down that the boundary in which the variable is accessible is known as scope, right? So here you can see that I'm having a code snippet in which I'm saying that we are having a function, and inside function we are having a test variable, and I'm logging the test inside that function, and I'm also logging that test variable outside the function, right? So here the scope of this variable is only up to this yellow box right over here, okay? And inside this yellow box I can only access this variable test, but let's say if I'm logging that test variable outside of that function, it is not accessible, okay? So in simple words I can say that the test variable is only having the scope within this function, right? So that's the concept over here, okay? So yeah, let's move on. So here in JavaScript, there are majority of the times there are only two types of scope. Number one is known as the function scope, and the second one is known as the block scope. And block scope is the concept which came later on in ES6 features, right? So let's discuss the function scope, and I want you to know that whenever you are discussing the function scope side of things, just imagine that whenever you are talking about function, so just remember that the variable scope or the function scope is the point in which the variable is only accessible within the function, right? So let's say if the same example which we have discussed previously, right? So here I know that the variable test is always function scoped whenever you use the var keyword for creating variables. So just remember that var is only function scope, right? You can only access var variable within this function scope, okay? And if you want to access this var variable outside the function, it will throw an error, okay? So that's how function scopes work, right? And whenever you talk about the block scope, right? So block scope, just imagine that block scope is always concerned with the curly brackets, right? With the starting curly bracket and ending curly bracket, okay? And the starting curly bracket and the ending curly bracket is commonly known as a block inside JavaScript, right? So just imagine that any variable which is defined inside this block with using let keyword or const keyword, that is known as a block scope, right? So you can just create those variables, and those variables will only be accessed within the block, and you cannot access them outside the block, right? So, and do remember that the block scope can be used by only those variables which are created with let or const, right? So block scope is way different from function scope, right? So in simple words, just assume that when I talk about function scope, so it simply means the variable which can be accessed through the whole function, right? That's function scope. And whenever I call, or I would say we are discussing the block scope, so just imagine that block scope is a concept which is just related to the starting of curly bracket and the ending of curly bracket, which is commonly known as the block, right? So you can only access block scope variables inside that those specific block, right? And in case of block, it's always the variables which are starting with let or const, and for function it's always the variable which are starting with the var keyword, right? So that's the concept over here. So let's move on. Let's discuss one of the terms which is, I would say, it's more it's a lot confusing to the new upcomers who are upcoming into the JavaScript journey. So that concept is known as lexical scope. Now lexical scope is just a term whenever you hear about the lexical scope thing. So just imagine that lexical scope is somewhat which decides how you write the code, right? So in simple words, lexical scope is a thing in which where you are writing the code, so the way you write the code decides how your scope will be managed, right? So that's the concept over here. Okay, so let's say if you're writing a code, so what JavaScript engine will do is he will look at the code, and by seeing where you have written that code, it will manage the scope accordingly. So that is known as the concept of lexical scope, right? So let me just give you an example for that. So let's say if you're having a box, inside that you're having another box, right? And inside that you're having two other boxes as well, right? And this is the person right over here, and the main I would say motive of this person is to just uh, get out of all these boxes, right? So that's the concept over here, okay? And let's say you want to break this box, he will go outside, and he want to break this box, he will go outside, and finally at the end he will break all the boxes and will get outside of these boxes, right? So whenever you hear the word of lexical scope, just imagine this type of picture inside your brain, right? So in here every box is containing an individual, right? So let's say if this person breaks the box, he will meet this yellow person, right? And this yellow person will tell again this person will break the box, and then he will meet this pink person, right? And then he will break the box, he will meet this red person, and finally he will break the box and he will meet the global execution context. I mean that he will meet the outside world, right? So that's the concept over here, okay? So let's go one step further, and this is the example which will completely demonstrate that how these concepts work inside JavaScript, right? So let's say if I'm having a variable test, which is this find me thing, and I'm having a function which is having outer function which is returning another function which is inner, and then inside inner I'm returning another function which is innermost, and then finally inside this innermost thing I'm returning another function which is the box function, and inside this box function I'm just simply logging the variable test, right? And at the last line you are seeing that I'm calling all those functions one by one, right? So again here I'm just discussing the concept of functions as first class citizens, but just assume that this is just function which is returning another function, and that function is returning another function, like, so this is just a box inside box inside box and inside box, right? So that's the concept over here. So let's say at this point you say that you're trying to access the variable test, right? So what this person will do is, it's in simple words, I'm telling this person to find a person of, let's say, red color, okay? Find a person which is having a color of red, right? In here I'm saying that, yeah, go and find the variable test, right? So what JavaScript will do is JavaScript will first look inside this function. It will say, okay, there is no test person over here, so just break the box and let's go one step forward, right? And it will go to innermost function, okay? And inside this innermost function it will see, okay, no one exists here, no variable test exists here, so yeah, there is not anyone here, so just break the box and go one step forward into the inner one. So here we also know that there is no one with the test, and let's say it will break the box and go with the outer one, and here we also know that there is no individual involved with the red color, or the variable test is not available there. So again it will break the box, and finally it will meet the global execution context, the global level, and here you will see that, yeah, this is the test variable which is available, so it will go and print the value of find me right over here, okay? So that's the concept over here. So lexical scope is a concept in which you break the box and go one step forward, right? So let's say what will happen if this test variable is defined inside this innermost function, right? So what this will do is it will just break the box, and whenever it comes to the innermost function, it will find that variable test, and then it will say, okay, yeah, I'm done. So it will stop looking outside other boxes, right? It will stop breaking the box and look outside. So that's the concept of lexical scope, right? So in here what I mean is, where you have written the code, based on that code JavaScript will handle the scope, right? So JavaScript engine will handle the scope, right? So if that function is not having the variable of test, it will go out until it find the variable test, right? So it will go outside of the lexical scope, and it will try to find that variable test, right? So that's the concept over here, okay? So let's move on to the next slide, and let's see that how this thing will look inside our call stack, right? So in call stack we will be having our global execution context, and we will push our outer function, then we will push our inner function, then we will push our innermost function, and then finally the box function will be pushed, and this box function is just printing the variable test, right? So you remember that from the previous video I have told you that these function calls, I would say these function execution context is always isolated from each other, right? So just assume that these are way different planets, right? So if you remember, I've always told you that each function call in the call stack is isolated with the rest of the other, right? So that's the concept here. But let's say if these things are isolated, so how come this test variable is being accessed, which is available in the global execution context, right? So here this test variable resides inside this global execution context, right? So how come this box can access something which is available in the global execution context, okay? And that is where the scope chain comes into the picture, right? So let's go one step forward, and here you can see the scope chain is something in which so this is our final state of our call stack, okay? So there is something which is a chain like structure which connects these two function execution context with each other, right? So we know that a single block here represents a single function call, which again creates a new execution context, and that execution context is known as the function execution context, right? So this function execution context is being linked with this function execution context. Again, moving on, this will be linked with this one, this will be linked with this one, and this will finally be linked with this global execution context. And this is what the concept of scope chain is, right? So scope chain is just a chain which, again, whenever you call a new function or whenever you create a new execution context, it will just form a chain of scope in which it will link the new function execution context with the previous function execution context. Here it is global execution, which is being connected with the outer, and the outer is being connected with inner, the inner is connected with the innermost, and finally the box is connected with the innermost function context, right? So that's the concept over here. Okay, same, it's something like this which we have discussed previously, right? And this is how the scope chain works in JavaScript, right? So I think, yeah, we are done with the slides part of things. So let's move on to our WebStorm side of things, and let's implement this concept, and let's see how this scope chain or scope or lexical scopes works in JavaScript, right? Okay, so let's start with the practical demonstration, and here you can see that I have opened my WebStorm and I have copy pasted the same example, right, from our slides. And let's discuss that how these things work, right? So here you can see that I'm having the same function layout, right, and I'm calling the same functions, okay, and which is accessing this test variable, and this test variable is defined on our global execution context, right? So this is the concept right over here, okay? So if I run this thing, you can see that I'm getting the value of nodes right over here, which is this variable test, okay? So I am able to access anything which is defined on global execution context, right? So the reason is because I know that this function will go out into the outer scope, right, into the parent function, right, which is our breaking the box and going inside the outer box, right? And somehow it will start finding the test variable, and as soon as it will find the test variable, it will just print that thing out, okay? So let me just show you one other example. So let's say if I'm having this test variable something defined over here, and let's say this test is having inside this innermost, right? And if I save this thing and if I run this thing again, you can see that at this point I'm getting this innermost thing right over here. And the reason is because I told this function that go and find test variable, right? So since test is not in this thing, it will go into the outer scope, right, into the scope of the parent function, right? And at this point it is known that, yeah, this test thing do exist in this function innermost. So yeah, it has perfectly found that test variable, so it will go and print that thing out, right? So the point is that as soon as this person the person individual finds the outermost person, it will stop looking for searching, right? And it will just print that thing onto the console, okay? So this is the concept of scope chain, right? So these are just being interlinked with the concept of those scopes right over here, okay? So now let's understand the concept of function scope and block scope, right? So we have discussed that function scope is something which is always available within the function, right? And those are especially with the variables which are created with var keyword, right? So let's say if I'm having a function, and let's say this function is having abc, something like that, and inside this I will be having a variable of test, and let's say this is having something like nodes, right? And what I can do is I can just console log this thing inside this function, right? And we all know that variable or function is scoped, so yeah, I can access this test variable inside the function, okay? But let's say if I'm having a console log over here in which I'm just calling that test variable, so I won't be able to access the test variable over here, because the reason is that test is only function scoped, right? So this test variable only resides inside this function, right? So yeah, we can check that. So let's say if I call my abc function over here, and let's run this thing. So if you run this thing, you can see that we are getting nodes, right? So we are getting nodes. The reason is because nodes is accessible inside this function, right? But the problem is that on line number 8 it is saying that, yeah, this console.log test is saying reference test is not defined, right? So at this point on line number 8, JavaScript engine has failed to find this test variable. The reason is because test is only available inside this function scope, right? So that's the concept of function scope, right? And now let's discuss the block scope, right? So remember, block scope is only concerned with the curly brackets thing, right? So if you're having a curly brackets, and those block scope is only for let and const, right? So if I'm having a variable defined with let's say let test, let me just spell that right, let's test is equal to, let's say, nodes, right? And if I do console.log test, I can access test inside this. But if I somehow come over here and try to access that test variable outside this, so you can see that it will always throw an error, and even the WebStorm is complaining you that you have an unresolved variable of type test, and the reason is because test is block scope, right? So if you run this thing, you can see that somehow we can access the variable inside the block but not outside the block, and it is saying on line number 8 it is again complaining you with the same error, right? That test is not defined. And same goes with the const, right? So if you do something like const and if you run this thing, it will result same. So you can see that I'm having nodes as an output, but the test is still not being accessed, right? But if I change this thing to var, but now you can see that things are looking way different on our WebStorm IDE, and the reason is because var is function scoped, right? So till now you can see that we are inside our global execution context, right? And inside global execution context means that we are inside that global function, right? So this means that the var can be accessed even outside this block scope, right? Because var is function scoped, right? So if you run this thing, you can see that both are printing nodes, okay? And this is the main difference between the var, let, and const, right? So yeah, that's it for now. I think you have understood the concept of how function scopes work, how block scopes work, what is the lexical scope thing, and what is the scope chain, right? So yeah, that's it for now. If you're liking my content, so do like and subscribe the channel. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.